Hello and welcome to this Astranti video. Today we'll be looking at the guidelines for stress testing a strategy. The purpose of stress testing is to find areas of weakness where there is potential for failings so that these can be controlled or fixed. And this video explores how organisations can approach this. Throughout this video we'll be using the running fictional example of Pete's plumbing to help bring out each point. If you're studying for P2 or P3, this is an extract from our video on Chapter 16 of our P2 course, but it will also be relevant if you're studying for P3. If you want to see the full video, this can be found on the Astranti website, where you can find a whole range of study materials to help you pass your CIMA exams. But for now, let's jump in and consider the guidelines for stress testing a strategy.
And these guidelines are gauging the scenarios that you might face, looking at whether they are one-off events or whether they are everyday events. Then look at how you might mitigate those particular risks. And finally, how you integrate that mitigation into your existing strategy. So let's take a look at each of these in turn, starting with gauging scenarios. Now, whilst looking at individual risks is useful, in reality, lots of risks are going to be related. You don't just face one risk at a time. So it's useful instead to consider scenarios where there are perhaps several risks present, because it's very unlikely that everything is going to remain absolutely consistent and it's just one particular issue that happens at a time. So it's useful to consider lots of different things at once and map these out in different scenarios. This will allow the organizations to prepare for real world events. So what does this mean for, say, Pete's plumbing? Well, rather than just consider one particular risk, he might consider lots of different risks at once. Let's say that this national chain is going to move into his area, so that's the risk of a large competitor taking some of his business. But because this large competitor is going to need a lot of supplies, they're perhaps going to buy up lots of stock from the various different plumbing supply companies. And as a result of this increased demand, there might be increased supply costs to try and keep up with this demand. So if a large competitor moves into the area, Pete might not only face the risk of competition, he might also face the risk of rising supply costs. So Pete will now need to consider this scenario and need to consider how his business is going to get around the fact that the costs are going to go up and the demand for his services might go down. He then needs to consider the one-off or the everyday. And effective stress testing should consider both everyday risks and one-off risks. So one-off risks could be a cybersecurity breach. That's not an everyday occurrence. It could just be one event that happens once a year, or it might just happen randomly at one time where you have some information stolen. So you need to learn how to deal with that risk, how you're going to mitigate against that risk, perhaps by bringing in more advanced security measures. Or it could be an everyday risk such as currency risks, where currency fluctuates on a daily basis, and if you're a multinational organization, that can have an impact. So how would Pete deal with his one-off risk of a large competitor? Well, the problem with trying to mitigate against one-off risks is that they are one-offs. They haven't happened before, so it's quite difficult to draw up a plan for how you're going to deal with that. So what he might do is look for precedents in other organizations. So let's look at the risk. The risk is that this large national chain is moving into his local area. So what he might do is look at the plumbing companies, the local plumbing companies in other areas that dealt with the same problem of this national chain moving in. And once he's looked at how they got around the issue, how they ensured that they stayed afloat and they continued to be successful, he can then model what he's going to do on what they did. And an everyday risk could be the rising supply costs, because it's going to need supplies on a daily basis. So we've now broken down those risks into the one-offs and also the everyday risks. And with the everyday risk, we need to have a strategy in place to manage that risk on an ongoing basis. So it could be something like purchasing supplies in bulk when the price is low, so that we have enough supplies over a long extended period. The price does increase during that period, we still have enough supplies. But of course, it's really important that you actually act on these risks once you have identified them. There's no point in conducting stress test analysis if you're not actually going to do anything about these risks once you've identified them. So it's very important that we do create plans to deal with these risks. So for example, with Pete's Plumbing, one of the risks was that this large national chain was going to move into his local area. So he might plan how he would move into a new area should that occur as a way of mitigating the impact. Or he could also bring on subcontractors to increase the amount of business that he can do in a set period. But it's also really important that we remember that these are just assumptions. And there's a real risk that you rely on these assumptions too much. Remember, these are just risks that we have predicted may happen in the future. We've also predicted the impact that these risks might have on the business, when in reality they might not actually happen, and even if they do happen, they might not have the same level of impact that we had predicted. So it's important that we don't go back to the drawing board and completely scrap our entire strategy just because we think that this thing might happen in the future. So while the results don't need to necessarily be acted on immediately, it's important that we are aware of them, and it's important that we have strategies in place that we can enact should the risk actually arise. So we don't go back to the drawing board and completely change the business just because these risks might happen. We just have plans in place so that we can mitigate them should they occur. But it's also very important that we integrate this into our process, into our planning process, into our budgetary process. So, for example, Pete had a strategy in place to expand into a nearby city should this national competitor move into the market. So he should allocate resources, set aside resources needed for that expansion should he need to actually undertake this expansion. So there's no good in planning to expand into this city should this national competitor move in and then spend all your money on your existing operations. So you actually haven't got any money available to fund this expansion when it comes round to actually needing to expand. So those are the 4 guidelines for stress testing a strategy. Your stress testing plan should look at future scenarios, should distinguish between one-off and everyday, and also the risks that you've identified should be mitigated and integrated into your plan. So that's a very brief introduction into stress testing. I hope you now have a good idea of what we ultimately mean by the concept of stress testing. It's all about identifying risks and considering what impact they will have on your organization, and then taking mitigating steps, or at least planning for the worst case scenario and planning what you would do should this risk actually arise.
So we've come to the end of this video, and you should now have a firmer grasp of the guidelines for stress testing a strategy. Intrigued to learn more? Well, you can find the full video on our website, where you can also find a wide range of resources to help you pass your CIMA exams. If you've enjoyed this video, why not subscribe to one of our many social media accounts? You can be found on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube, where you can find many more videos on a multitude of topics. That's all for now, and thanks for watching.